paper is The Cursing the Fig Tree, number 90. Now, the cursing of the fig tree by Jesus Christ has great significance for the ritual of the Church of God, and it falls in the sequence for the cleansing and sanctification of the temple. For that reason, it's important to the Passover period. Let's look at this question of the cursing of the fig tree. In Matthew chapter 21, we read of the cursing of the fig tree in the sequence following on from Jesus' entry to Jerusalem and the cleansing of the temple. In Matthew 21, 1-22, we read, "Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, 'Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, "The Lord needs them," and he will send them at once.' This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, 'Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden.' The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the ground, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowd that went before him and that followed him were shouting, 'Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!' And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, 'Who is this?' And the crowd said, 'This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee.'" And in verse 12 we read, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and brought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, 'It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers.' And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant. And they said to him, 'Do you hear what these are saying?' And Jesus said to them, 'Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babes you have prepared praise,' and leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there." Now in verse 18, we proceed to the cursing of the fig tree. It says in verse 18, "In the morning as he was returning to the city, he became hungry, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, 'May no fruit ever come from you again.' And the fig tree withered at once. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, 'How did the fig tree wither at once?' And Jesus answered them, 'Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, Be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith.'" If we view this in relation to Mark 11, we see that the sequence of changes. Thus there is a series of actions taking place that are repeated. In Mark 11, 1-33 we read, "Now when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, 'Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, "Why are you doing this?" say, "The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately." And they went away and found a colt tied at a door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of those standing there said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let him go. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it, and many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. At verse 12 it goes on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. In verse 15 it says, "And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers? And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. Now let's look at the lesson from the withered fig tree. Verse 20, it says, and they passed by in the morning, and they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt it in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, and it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven may forgive you and your trespasses. This follows on in verse 27 in terms of the challenging the authority of Jesus. And it says, and they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things, or who gave you this authority to do them? Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question, answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. What was the baptism of John, from heaven or from man? Answer me. And they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say from man? They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. So this sequence shows that he entered the temple on consecutive days and cleansed it. He was entering the temple to ensure it was cleansed from the first of Abib onwards in accordance with the law and the sections we see listed in Ezekiel 45 verses 18 to 25. In Ezekiel 45 verse 18 onwards we read, thus saith the Lord God, in the first month and the first day of the month you shall take a bull from the herd without blemish and purify the sanctuary. And the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering and put it on the doorposts of the temple, and the four corners of the ledge of the altar, and the posts of the gate of the inner court. You shall do the same on the seventh day of the month for anyone who has sinned through error or ignorance. So you shall make atonement for the temple. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall celebrate the feast of the Passover, and for 7 days unleavened bread shall be eaten. On that day the prince shall provide for himself and all the people of the land a young bull for a sin offering. And on the 7 days of the festival he shall provide as a burnt offering to the Lord 7 young bulls and 7 rams without blemish on each of the 7 days, and a male goat daily for a sin offering. And he shall provide as a grain offering an ephah for each bull, an ephah for each ram, and a hin of oil to each ephah. In the 7th month and the 15th day of the month, and for the 7 days of the feast, you shall make the same provision for sin offerings, burnt offerings and grain offerings, and for the oil. These cross-references to the text in Genesis 8:13, Exodus 12:18, 29:1-14, all cross-reference back to this text. In Ezekiel 43:18, we see that the consecration begins with the altar, whereas the consecration of the priest is required by the Levitical priesthood under the law from Leviticus 8:1-10. Thus here we are dealing with a priesthood already sanctified and commencing the sacrifices of the altar within a new system. In this, the Zadokites are the only Levites to be admitted from Ezekiel 40 verse 46 and 44:15. Compare that also with Revelation chapter 7. This is the priesthood of Melchizedek. This priesthood preceded Levi, and Levi tithed to it in the loins of Abraham. Shem was its high priest from the time of Noah. It was placed at Jerusalem until David occupied Jerusalem. The king there was titled as Adonizedek or Melchizedek on a continual basis, as we see from Scripture. Compare the paper of Melchizedek, number 128, for this purpose. Now this being was not Jesus Christ for a number of sound scriptural reasons. Jesus Christ could not have been a human being at Jerusalem and appear at the same time to Abraham as the angel of Jehovah with 2 other beings at the destruction of Sodom. Moreover, as the angel of Jehovah, he was with Israel in the wilderness and in the occupation of Jericho and all Canaan. How then could he also be there in Jerusalem as Adonizedek? And what is the purpose of the incarnation if it was already a fact over some 500 years previously? And you see that aspect dealt with in the paper The Angel of Jehovah, number 24. In the text in Exodus 29:36, a bullock is offered on 7 consecutive days. Here it is offered only once, and on the other days a kid of the goats. This is clearly another temple and another sequence. These offerings in Ezekiel 43:18-27 are national and priestly, whereas the priestly represents the nation. Bullinger sees that they are not individual, but assumes that there will be no Day of Atonement, and deduces from this fact that they will not be as under the law. Now, whilst they will be in the millennial system, and the application of the law will differ under Christ regarding the sacrifices, the fact that the feasts follow from Passover to Tabernacles and Atonement and Trumpets are not mentioned, and you see that in Ezekiel 45 verses 24 and 25, does not mean they will not be kept. And see that in the paper on the FAQs on Ezekiel chapters 36 and 48, and also in the paper The Sanctification of the Temple, number 292. It is also noted that the new moons are not considered working days and will be enforced in the millennial system. And we see that from Ezekiel 45 following, and also Isaiah 66:23, and those who do not keep them will die, from Isaiah 66:24. So the Sabbaths and the new moons are not working days, and they will be enforced in the millennial system under Ezekiel's temple, and people who do not keep them will die. Now the sequence of the cleansing then takes place from the first of the first month through the 7th. Christ took it on to the 10th day when he entered Jerusalem. He was hungered in this sequence. That would normally be interpreted as showing that he had fasted over this period. There is a point of fasting in which you become hungered. It's quite likely he fasted for the period on a number of days, or even all of them, although he seems to have passed periods at the houses of several of his friends during that time. The cleansing of the temple from the accounts in the Gospels tells us that he was in the temple cleansing the temple and ensuring it was clear of money changers and such parasites from the accounts in Matthew, Mark and Luke. Thus, after the sanctification of the simple and the erroneous, Christ went to Jerusalem, approaching from Jericho on the 8th of Abib, and passed the Thursday night in the house of Zacchaeus. The first entry to Jerusalem was from Bethphage on the day of 9 Abib, that was the Friday, and it was not from Bethany, and you compare that with Matthew 21:8-9. He was unexpected, and he then cleansed the temple from Matthew 21:12-16, and he then departed for Bethany from Matthew 21:17. The sequence is outlined in the tables in the paper The Timing of the Crucifixion and the Resurrection, number 159. On the 11th of Abib, the 4th day before the Passover, he entered the temple and looked around and then returned to Bethany. You see that in Mark 11:11. On the 12th of Abib, the 3rd day before the Passover in 30 of the current year, he reappeared in the temple and re-cleansed it, and then taught in the temple from Mark 11:15-17 and Luke 19:45-46. He faced the opposition of the rulers from Mark 11-18 and Luke 19 verses 47 and 48, and then left the city, probably for Bethany, from Mark 11:19 and Luke 21:37-38. On the 2nd day before the Passover, on 13th of Abib, which was a Tuesday, Christ is again in Jerusalem and the temple. In Matthew 21:23 and 27, and Mark 11:27-33, and Luke 20 verses 1-8. The first great prophecy is then given in the temple from Luke 21 verses 5-36. The statement re the Lord's custom is made in this last week from Luke 21:37-38. Then the second great prophecy is given on the Mount of Olives from Matthew 24 verses 1-51 and Mark 13 verses 1-37, and continued in Matthew 25 1-46. Christ, by his clear example in the Gospels, was cleansing the temple entirely over this period from 1 Abib as required by law, right up until 13th Abib or Nisan, which was the beginning of the preparation day for the Passover. At the end of 13 Abib, he and the disciples retired to the upper room for the last or Lord's Supper and the betrayal and trial of Messiah and the crucifixion of the Passover lamb on the afternoon of 14 Abib. Now let's look now at this lesson of the fig tree. We've seen that Christ is continually cleansing the temple. We see the laws requiring the cleansing of the temple, and this should all tell us something about what's required of us. And in the millennial system, under Ezekiel's temple, we will be required to be cleansing the temple and fasting on the 7th of Abib for the simple and the erroneous. These are all instructions in the laws of God. They are biblical instructions. Now let's look at the lesson of the fig tree. A major lesson to be learnt in this process of cursing the fig tree was that it was set within and related to the process of the preparation for the Passover and was part of the cleansing process. The reference to the absence of fruit and the curse was a lesson for the churches of God, that in this process of cleansing, that which failed to bear fruit was thus left to wither and die. This lesson was never more appropriate in the latter part of the 20th century, when the cleansing was never undertaken and the preparation for the Passover was never directed at the sanctification and salvation of Israel and the nations. So this very important process of the sanctification of the temple was eliminated from the churches of God, either through ignorance or stupidity, during the last part of the 20th century. It is for this reason that the parables in Matthew and Mark follow on, dealing with the obtaining of other labour and other sons. One promises to go and labour, and one refuses to promise. However, the one who promised does not go, and the one who refused went and worked as the father required. Now this parable was directed at Judah and Levi, and ultimately Israel. The parable of the absent landowner, we see from Mark 12:1-12, was about the prophets and Christ himself, and the vineyard was the whole house of Israel. And you see that in Isaiah 5:7. And you see this matter dealt with in the paper, The Covenant of God, number 152. And let's look at this question of the vineyard and the matters that subsequently follow from that. Let's look at the parable of the tenants. Mark 12:1-12. In Mark 12:1-12 we read, "And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. Now when the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and they killed. Him they killed. And so with many others, some they beat and some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally he sent him to them, saying, They will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away." Now here we see the tenants of the house of Israel, who were the priests and Levites charged with the work of God, and also the house of Judah that had been broken down by Edomites and the Hellenized practices. The message was to the elect of the nation, and then to the church that was to follow them. Let's look at this concept of rendering to Caesar. The separation of the matters of the church from those of the world in the preparation period was emphasised in the lesson of giving to Caesar in Mark 12 verses 13 to 17. In verse 13 it starts, "And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?' But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, 'Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it.' And they brought one, and he said to them, 'Whose likeness and inscription is this?' And they said to him, 'Caesar's.' And Jesus said to them, 'Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' And they marvelled at him." Now the sequence of the parables is given as they are to impart teaching to the church. Each of these has a lesson to not only to the Jews. As we read them in the text, they are to talk to us in terms of the sanctification period and this development of the faith, so that we see what our duties are in dealing with the church through the Holy Spirit, and also in rightly discerning that which the church should do for the church and what people should do in relation to their civil responsibilities. Let's look at the church of the resurrection. Now Christ dealt with the Sadducees also at that time regarding the resurrection in Mark 12:18 to 27. "And the Sadducees came to him who say that there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, 'Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no child, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and when he died left no offspring, and the second took her and died, leaving no offspring, and the third likewise. And the 7 left no offspring. Last of all, the woman also died. In the resurrection, when they rise again, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as a wife.' And Jesus said to them, 'Is this not the reason you are wrong? Because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong.' In this text also he spoke of the resurrection from Mark 12:18 to 27, and the church as the resurrected firstborn. For he said when he spoke to Moses in the burning bush, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is the God of the living and not the dead. Therefore Christ here speaks of the church, who are those who have fallen asleep in the Lord. So all of the church, from Adam right through the prophets, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to Moses and Aaron, and all of those of the resurrected church, or the church of the resurrection, fall under this question of God being their God, because he is the God of the living and not the dead. All of them hold the hope of the resurrection. And they are those who are fallen asleep in the Lord. And that is why Paul uses the term fallen asleep in the Lord. It is the process of the preparation of the temple that is undertaken from 1 Abib through to the Passover. Then unleavened bread is eaten 7 days from the 15th to the 21st of Abib, and the fasting month is brought to a 7-day close, returning to the normal process in the Omer account of Pentecost and the wheat harvest, which is the harvest of the church of the firstborn. This process is a sequence starting from the 1st of Abib and in effect ending with the resurrection of the church in the month 50 days after the wave sheaf offering, which occurs from the Sunday within the Passover. This sequence is part of the tree required to bear fruit. And the tree that doesn't fast and prepare itself in sanctification is cursed and withers and dies.